Welcome. You are listening to the One Flock podcast, where we aim to equip the church as we strive to be one flock with one shepherd, the Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you for being a part of this flock of listeners and joining us for today's episode. Well, hello. Thank you for joining us today on One Flock podcast. Man, we've had some great weather these last couple of days in Florida. It got really cool, or fairly cool. So beautiful. Just reminds me of God's goodness in creation and makes me reflect on all the blessings in life. And so we're grateful. I've been reminded to be grateful today. We didn't talk about this earlier, but yeah, just been reflecting on God's goodness. So one of the things I'm grateful for is to be here with my dear friend, Bill Cole-Clazier, who's senior pastor at our church, Pine Ridge Presbyterian Church in Orlando, Florida. So if you're in Orlando, come join us if you don't have a church home yet. Today, we are on another one of our Q&A episodes. We've got some questions from you, our listeners, which we love getting, and we want to try to take a couple of them. We have two that we're going to try to answer today that are great questions. The first one is an ethical question, sort of how to apply the morality of the Bible in modern context. And the other one's a more theological one. So let's take them. The first one is an anonymous questioner asks, is assassination, say of an evil political leader, ever morally acceptable? And no, I'm not thinking of committing one.
I'm glad they put that in there.
The clarifying question. They're thinking about it as a concept, but not as I want to do this. But anyways. All right. What do you say, Bill?
Well, do you want me to start this one, or do you want to start it?
I could do that. I could start
Go ahead,
this
you
one.
start it
That's
off.
fine. So, okay, let's think about this a little bit first. So, an assassination is the taking of a life of another person. So, what does the Bible have to say about taking the life of another person? Well, we know the sixth commandment in the 10 Commandments is thou shalt not murder. Okay. Now, I think it's the King James and maybe some other translations translate that as thou shalt not kill, which if you just take it as it reads, you could take it as a universal killing is always bad. But the original language and the way many other modern translations translate that word is a little bit more accurate. Murder is a specific type of killing that has to do with the unjust taking the life of another person. So the Bible gives us, well, let's talk about that for a minute. What are some biblical examples of wrongly taking of another person's life? We talked about earlier how David took the life of Uriah. He came up with a scheme after he had committed adultery with this man Uriah's wife, and he schemed to have Uriah sent to the front of the battlefield so that he would die.
And the rest of the army pulled back away from him, so he'd be surrounded and killed.
So
it's like putting a hit contract out on somebody.
Right. So, that was David murdering Uriah, which, man, sometimes we forget how David's life was so messed up with sin, but ours is too. But he committed the sin of murder, so that's wrong. That's an unjust taking of another human being's life, and there are more in the Bible. But let's take the other question: is there ever a biblical example where someone takes another person's life and it's not condemned as murder, as an unjust killing? And maybe a prime example of that would be in the book of Judges. You have one of the judges, Ehud, who God raises up. The context of that is that there are these sequence of judges, which is not like a judge with a gavel and in a robe who's making moral arbitrations, but a judge was more of a military leader, someone that God raised up for Israel to deliver them from these evil rulers that had oppressed them. So there's one example of this King Eglon, who is this Moabite king, and he came and took over part of the land of Israel and was oppressing the people, and God raised up Ehud as a judge. And there's a scene in Judges chapter 3 where Ehud goes secretly with this sword and ends up basically assassinates this king. And then he does a good job of kind of hiding it so that he can escape. But he's held up as a judge who delivers. God raises up to commit this assassination.
Are you telling me then that God instructed Ehud to do this?
Well, it says that. Well, let me read the verse. Judges 3:15. But when the sons of Israel cried to the Lord raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud the son of Gera, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. And so then it says what they did. They came up with this plot to send a tribute to the king, and they sent Ehud to deliver it. And then first thing he does when he gets there is he stabs the king and kills him.
What does he say to the king, though? I think he says something like, I have a message.
I have a secret message for you, O king.
Yeah.
And the king said, keep silence. And then he came in when he was sitting alone. I have a message from God for you. Mm-hmm. And he arose from his seat. Ehud stretched out his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly.
Mm-hmm. You don't have to read anymore. It's
yeah.
But the point is that people would raise their right hand, showing that they have no weapon, because not everybody, but most people are right-handed. Even today, when we wave to people, it's related to the idea that I'm weaponless and I'm coming in peace. Mm-hmm. And so Ehud did that, and then he pulls from his right thigh the long knife or small sword, and then he kills him. But it was a message from whom?
From God.
From God. Right. A secret message I have for you. So there is an assassination that God lined up, and even had it trickery, like it was done in a way that's not like, deceptive. I'm going to assassinate you, but it's done. It's sort of a clandestine or surreptitious kind of way of doing it. And that's sort of like Ai, when God sent them there. Do you remember? He says, I want you to divide the army, Joshua, into 3 groups. And these 2 groups hide off in the bushes and the trees. Don't let anybody see you. And the main one, go and attack the front gate of the city. And then as soon as they come out, run like crazy, and they'll come out after you. And once the army is outside the city, then the 2 side groups go. This is God's strategy. It's not is that fair? Is it murder? I think they were supposed to kill every single person in Ai, if I remember right. Even the animals and everything. This is called under the ban. But you ask about killing. I mean, assassination, yeah, sure. If it's a just war, and that's always the question, and it gets very controversial and very tricky. And if I were a soldier, I would, as far as I understand, when you take an oath to be an American soldier, there is something in the oath that if you think what is happening is truly against your conscience and immoral, then you don't have to do it just because your captain orders it. So if, like in the Malay massacre, when they machine gunned down a bunch of people that had even taken their clothes off to show that they had no weapons, and they were trying to surrender, and the captain gave the order to the soldiers to gun them down, and they murdered these people who were just trying to give themselves up. And that became this big thing. You may not have even heard of it, but during the Vietnam War. But see, that is where, if you're a soldier, you say, no, I'm not gonna, these people are unarmed, and why should I do that? Just because you tell me to murder them? I'm not going to do that. So there's all kinds of things that we're human beings, and we can think. We're made in the image of God, and we don't just take blind orders to do stuff that's going to be killing. But there are times in warfare when assassination might be okay. Like, why don't you take like Hitler and maybe talk about Bonhoeffer or something like that?
Yeah, it's been a while since I read the work by Eric Metaxas on Bonhoeffer, which is extremely good. But it goes into great detail, as well as other works do, about the Bonhoeffer's role in the assassination plot against Hitler.
Was he a Christian?
Oh, definitely.
Was he a pastor?
Definitely, and a seminary teacher. And absolutely. He was a very devoted Christian. Right. And he, went through the moral dilemma of if this was right to be a part of or not. And ultimately he came down on, yes, it was his conscience actually provoked him to be a part of it because of the great evil that Hitler was, and that this was a just war and a just cause. So ultimately their assassination attempt failed to kill Hitler, and he was executed ultimately for his being a part of it.
Sure.
But you have, examples such as that of clearly people who are Christians who have really thought about it and who are a part of those types of things. So, anyways.
Yeah, but see, the problem with all this is, what is truth? It's an epistemological problem. What if you happen to be a Christian Palestinian, and there are a lot of them, and they, from their perspective, might see a leader in Israel as being an oppressor to them, and that they might feel like we've got to take our land back that was given by the UN. Who are they? They're nobody. Why are we, go on and on.
Yeah.
And so it depends on your view of reality and truth. So it would be very, very complex for me,
Definitely.
even as a soldier, to assassinate a world leader. I don't know if I would even go into that branch or something like that. But the question is theoretically.
Theoretically,
you have to say there have to be situations where it would be all right.
Yeah, the question is specifically, is assassination ever morally acceptable? And so our answer to that would be yes, but to figure out when it is the hard part, I think.
And in warfare by itself, I mean, there's a building, and you're guiding a missile, through your computer or something in the military to a building, and you don't know who's in there. There may be hostages held in there.
Right.
So what is that? It's kind of at a distance, so sometimes, we just push the button. No, there are people dying because you did it, but you're doing it because you were told to do it. You know what I'm saying? It gets complicated.
Definitely.
War is, as they say, war is hellish or hell, and I certainly could understand that. And I'm glad that I've never been in combat or even in the military for that reason. But I feel really, really sympathetic. That's all I can say for PTSD.
People with PTSD.
Yeah, because right now they're on the news with all this stuff going on in the Near East, Middle East. The bombs, you hear it hear the machine guns and the bombs exploding. Can you imagine if you'd been a combat soldier in one of these earlier wars, what that would be doing to your psyche?
Oh yeah,
and
I've thought about that before, but
I've been thinking about that, and I feel for these people that have had to make impossible decisions. I was ministering on a mission trip to a man who had been a sergeant in house-to-house combat, I guess in one of the, Iraq maybe or someplace, Desert Storm or something, and he was haunted by the fact that they kicked in the door of where they thought these militants were, and it's dark. You kick the door in. I think they throw in one of these concussion grenades that just shocks and a flash and everything, and then they just took their guns and machine gun and when the smoke cleared and everything, it was women and children that they just had killed. And he just couldn't get over that. I mean, I prayed with him and everything else, but it's those kind of things happen in war, and it's just like, makes you sick, So assassination is one thing, war is another thing. Valuing human life and not murdering is another thing, and how that all works out, it's individually. God puts it in here that we're humans, and we should treat even our enemies, give them a cup of cold water. If they surrender or something, then you treat them in a way that has dignity. At least that's the way I would perceive it.
Right. Okay. That's a tough one. So the next one is more theological. Mary Margaret asks, what does Reformed theology teach about dispensations?
Well, you can start if you wish. I don't have to.
Go ahead, Bill. You got this.
No. Well, you think of the word to dispense. That's where the word dispensation comes from. It means to give something out in a quantity, right? To dispense it. A pharmacy dispenses a certain quantity of your prescription drugs, 50 pills or whatever. And that's a dispensary, I think they called it in the old days.
Right.
And so the dispensational way of looking at the Bible, historically, and it always morphs and changes. Let's do a little subset of that. Dallas Theological Seminary, for instance, has been a bastion for what's called modern dispensationalism, which is that dispensing of things. But it all comes from Schofield, and the Schofield Reference Bible, I think we've all heard about that, and it's been very popular in America. And it came from Schofield was a disciple of a man named Darby, who was a Presbyterian minister over in England, and this is in the 1800s. And there was the Welsh revival that penetrated into England in those days, and it was most revivals that happen are associated associated with the revival are things that we would think are not very good, like people getting extra biblical revelation, speaking in tongues and interpretation, words of knowledge. All these things are happening kind of in the periphery of that. And then the gospel, of course, is there too, and people are being converted. So in the Welsh revival, Pastor Darby was really involved in that. And according to history, there were a couple of teenage girls, that the McDonald sisters, and according to history, a lot of people don't like this. They would say, "Oh no, that's the..." Well, I've seen the actual photographic reprints of what took place, and it was written down and so forth. I don't have it anymore. I've loaned it out. Pastors don't. We loan stuff out and it never comes back, and that happens a lot. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that Darby received in a trance. These girls would fall into trances and then give special knowledge about the interpretation of difficult passages in the Bible. And Daniel chapter 9 was interpreted in a trance. And the elders were standing around while this girl was in the office. I think they had her on a table or something. She was in a trance. And she explained for the first time in human history that Daniel chapter 9 was written about the 70 weeks. And the 69th and 70th week then became this basis for dispensational theology, okay? And I don't want to go into all those details. We don't have time to do it. But if that's true, it's really interesting because most dispensationalists don't even believe that there's extra biblical revelation. They're not Pentecostals, generally speaking.
Right.
And so, but that's, if they knew that was the beginning of it. And by the way, I brought here this book. John Thompson, an Orthodox Presbyterian minister who passed away, was a friend of mine, and he had a collection of ancient books. This one is before the Revolutionary War. It has all the Reformed confessions in there. The book's still in good shape, and it's really interesting to see all the little diagrams of like teepees and women churning the milk and chickens and stuff, because I'm sure that the man gave it to his kids sitting in the pew next to him while they were drawing, and they draw little things. It's so cute. But anyway, this book is not quite 100 years, like 50 years later than that one. But this represents a commentary on the Bible. This is 1 out of 5 volumes right here. And I was given 1 volume that includes Daniel. Now, why commentaries like this are so important, Eric, let me just ask you so you can participate a little bit. Mm-hmm. We as pastors, we're trying to teach a Bible study or create a sermon. We'd like to read commentaries. One of the things it does is what? What does the commentary help you see?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that relates to, I think, what we're talking about is views that have been held throughout history about what these passages are teaching. Okay. So often the commentator will give his own view, and then he'll briefly survey some other views and maybe provide answers to objections.
Yes, that's right. Usually it works like this. They give other views. Like here, this group says this, and that's why they say it. Yep. This one says this. Over here, this person says that, and that's interesting. But here's why I think that it's this. Right. And so you get all the different possible views that were extant at the time. Yes. Now, this was written in early 1800s. Before 1832 is when these girls gave their interpretation, or this girl gave her interpretation of Daniel chapter 9. Are you with me so far?
Yeah.
It's kind of complicated. But this has all the different views of Daniel chapter 9 that were in the church. Okay? Mm-hmm. None of them have anything to do with how that is interpreted as the 70 weeks prophecy and the 69th and 70th week of the prophecy. That's very interesting, isn't it? And so Theology, as you know, is something that came to us like at the end of the Nicene Creed. Most of the stuff was done, and that was pretty early on. And you don't take novel ideas and say, oh, look now, God has given us a brand new idea about how to interpret the Bible and all the Old Testament and what the book of Revelation means and all that. Mm-hmm. Started when? 1832? Are you kidding me? Mm-hmm. What happened to all those Christians before that? Mm. They still had Daniel and the other passages, but they never thought it meant that. Mm-hmm. And so that already should be, as you're playing cards, you just reject that one. You have to, because there are no novel things that God reveals brand new that affect everybody's life and how to interpret history. It just doesn't happen like that. The Holy Spirit's been working in his church. He loves his church. He doesn't just do this in the 1800s. So that's right out of just out of hand. You just say no. But then when you look into it, you realize that this idea that Scofield took from Darby, and he wrote the Scofield Reference Bible, first Bible with a man's name on it. Every other version of the Bible had Holy Bible, and Scofield put Scofield Reference Bible. So right off that's kind of a bad thing.
You're
right
like red flags going on.
I definitely. How would you like the Eric Burkett Bible?
Oh
I
man,
don't
that
think
sounds
so.
awful.
Me either.
Never buy that.
So anyway, Scofield believed that God experimented on purpose. He knew, God knew, but he wanted humans to know that nothing works except grace. And so he divided the Bible, its dispensation of God's knowledge, into 7 categories. And they're historic. And the first one is innocence, and that was Adam and Eve. How did that work out? Bzzz. Okay, so then he gave human conscience is the next one. And that's between the fall of Adam and Eve and the destruction of the world in the flood of Noah. Right. So that didn't work. Bzzz. That even was worse in a way. I mean, that was terrible. Yeah. And then under Noah, you had the human government where God said, no, go out and settle the world and all this and make sure to teach not to murder each other and all that. And so human government, well, that didn't work out too well. Then he brought Abraham onto the scene, and that's another dispensation of God's showing that humans need something different. You can't promise. You can't succeed. You can't please God in any of these other methods. And so it comes to promise with Abraham, the promise. Mm-hmm. And then after the promise came Moses with the law. And then after the law came Christ. And this is the 6th one, which is the age of grace and the church. And then finally is the millennial kingdom that they believe is the 1,000-year kingdom that's coming. And that's kind of the fulfillment of the whole thing. But Scofield himself, according to the way people in his day and age, all the way up for maybe 100 or more years, the way dispensationalism was looked at is that each of these dispensations, if you happen to live during them, if you put your trust in what God was saying and you tried your hardest to live under conscience, to live under government, and trying your hardest, praying to God and all that, that would be your proof of salvation, or that would be the means by which you're saved. And finally, Jesus had to come and then provide grace, and now we live in the age of grace. And so it can go on for an hour about all this, but the point is that we don't see it that way. The Reformed faith, and that's what the question asks, we see a unity in all this. Right from the beginning, God killed an animal, or maybe 2, to clothe Adam and Eve, and it was a sacrifice. And he made garments to clothe their shame of their nakedness, and right there you have a blood sacrifice right off the bat. Mm-hmm. Then you have Abel, who brought the fat portions of the firstlings of his flock, which show that he understood that the Christ would come and be the sacrifice. And it's not anything he did. He had to do a blood sacrifice. Through the Old Testament, blood sacrifice. Noah brought 7 animals because of some of the clean ones, because some of them had to be sacrificed to God in a blood sacrifice, looking forward to Christ. Then Moses sets up the whole sacrificial system based upon the sacrifice of animals for sin, for instance, right? Like the lamb and the scapegoat and so forth. And then we come to Jesus, and John says, there's the Lamb of God. It's all continuity. Yeah. It's not like these different things. It's always been the same. It's always about God brings salvation through the Messiah, through Christ. And it's all very clear, and everything makes sense that way. It's not divided up into different dispensations like that. And so we see it as progressive revelation. It's kind of like if if you want to grow a tomato plant, you take tomato seeds, put them in a nice soil, keep it watered. Nothing happens for a while. And then all of a sudden there's a little sprout. And you think, what in the world? You don't know what it is yet. It's just this little thing that looks like a blade of grass. And then a couple weeks later, it's got leaves and it's getting taller. And then a couple weeks later, these little yellow tiny flowers come out. It's in the flowering stage. Mm-hmm. And then little tomatoes come out of those little flowers, little tiny green ones. And then after a while, you have tomatoes. And this is the progressive revelation. And Christ is the tomatoes, you might say, and the whole thing. But everything else is leading up to that, and it progresses through. All right, that's enough.
Got to quote you on that. Christ is the tomatoes. Oh, that's so good. Well, out of context, it makes no sense, but in context,
that's
it's great.
What Pastor Bill always taught, that Christ is a tomato.
Oh, that's good.
Well, that's from VeggieTales,
right? All right. Well, good. I mean, there's so many things to go into, but coming home on the question on that, the Reformed faith has generally always seen the continuity not only of the scriptures and how we look at them, and but how God's worked his plan of salvation out throughout history, so that there's been one plan of salvation, one means of salvation, one people of God throughout history. And so there's like you said, a progress or more and more revealing of this plan, which we would call progressive revelation. But seeing it work out throughout history and redemptive history is this unfolding or growth of the plan from seed form into fully grown, And so, we look at the Bible that way, and we see its, great continuity, which shows the continuity of God's plan throughout history.
What about his people?
Yeah. So that's what I was trying to say is or connect it to, is that because there's one plan of salvation, it follows, and the scripture teaches, that there's ultimately one people of God throughout history, and not, as some of the modern dispensationalists would argue, a great distinction between the people of Israel in the Old Testament and even till now, and the New Testament church, you could say. They like to highlight the distinction and show how God's plan involves two distinct groups, Israel and the church, whereas we would see more of a continuity, and that the Bible speaks of the church throughout all ages, even back to the Old Testament, where we see the words that are translated, let's say in the Septuagint, as the church in the Old Testament. The New Testament even references, like Stephen in Acts, at his martyrdom, references the church in the wilderness. So we see a continuity of the people of God throughout the Old and the New Testaments, that there's one people of God, there's one church, there's one bride of Christ, and there's one plan of salvation for them, unfolded throughout redemption.
Hebrews 11 is all about Old Testament people.
Mm-hmm.
And all of them are models for us for faith, because they were saved by the same faith in God's word, the promise of the Messiah, and the hope of the restoration of all things.
Yeah.
Eric, in Hebrews chapter 8, it tells us this. He says, he's speaking about God, he says, when he said a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. But whatever is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to disappear. Now, the point here is that even if you just separate the old dispensation and include many of those sub ones into the old covenant idea, and then we're now in the new covenant idea. But even if you do that, he's saying that the old covenant is obsolete, it's grown old at that time he was writing, which was before the destruction of Jerusalem. And he said it's ready to, what?
Disappear.
Mm-hmm. And that means forever. It doesn't mean it's just going to be put on the shelf for a while and then it's all going to come back. It's over. The temple curtain was written. It was theoretically over then when Jesus died on the cross. They stitched it back up. Mm-hmm. And God said, okay, I'll give you 40 years. He didn't say it, but that's in history. We look back at 40 years from the time of Christ's resurrection, basically, that he gave the Israelites, or the Jewish nation, a chance to become Christians. And many of them did. There were thousands. Remember in the book of Acts, the very first part of Acts is all about the Jews becoming Christians. Then when Cornelius was converted, because of what God was revealing to Peter, all the Jews are going, what? Even the Gentiles get to do that? But the first part of Acts is all about the thousands and thousands from during that 40-year period, see? So they were being converted and then assimilated into the Christian church and lost their identity after one or two generations. Right. And they're just people. They're just people who are part of the bride of Christ. And that's a wonderful thing. So anyway, there aren't two brides of Christ. There's not the wife of the Old Testament, Hosea's thing about Gomer and the God, and that's something that's totally different than what we call the bride of Christ, what the Bible calls the bride of Christ. God doesn't have two wives like Jacob had Rachel and Leah. He really loved Rachel, the Jews. That's the way that a lot of the dispensationalists see it. The Jews are really his, but he wants to make her jealous, so to speak, with Leah, and that's us. We're the weak-eyed ones, And it's like, the stinking Gentiles. But I'll use them, so I bring my people that I really love, the Jews, bring them back to be my people at the end of the age. That is, you could say anything you want. You can find Bible things to make up all kinds of stories. The Bible never teaches that. It says the old covenant is gone. The new covenant is here, and it's in Christ, and it's for Gentiles and Jews who are believers. And I know there are some passages, and we could look at those, but they're not foundational passages. The passages that the dispensational theologians use are weird little passages that are very difficult to interpret from any direction. I think it's First or Second Thessalonians 2. It talks about the man of destruction and that sort of thing. That's a very difficult passage.
Yeah.
But if you think that's talking about the end of the world, and then he says, don't believe these people who are writing letters. Paul says to them, in my name, in our name, don't believe them that Christ has already come and the world has already ended. Well, you wouldn't have to. I get a letter, from somebody who says, oh, Christ has come back and the world has ended. No, I think I would see that. I wouldn't. So it can't mean that. It has to mean probably the destruction of Jerusalem, which has overtones to the future, but not in and of itself. Yeah. Anyway, that's...
No, it's good. It's good. Yeah, there's some... Maybe in the future we'll have to go down more of those rabbit trails. But all right, great. Thank you, Bill. And thanks so much for the questions. Please keep them coming. We love them. Like I said, there's a link in the description. You can enter a question anonymously or not, and it can be about anything about the Christian life or Bible or theology. Yeah, we love them. So thanks for joining us today, and we will see you on the next one.